Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are midway through the 2030 playoffs. Our A's, after a very disappointing 71-91 record, were obviously not participants in the postseason this year. Last episode, we took a look at some of the top prospects in our system, some of the top prospects around baseball, and Hidero Endo, the most interesting man in baseball. This time around, we'll take a look at our team as we get closer to the beginning of the offseason. We are in the final year of our contract, so we'll also find out at the end of this episode whether we'll be back with the A's next year or whether this run in Oakland will come to a quite unceremonious end a year after winning an extremely unlikely World Series title. Taking a look at how our A's performed on the field this past season, that 71-91 record was 5 worse than expectations, but even 76-86 was not what we thought this team was going to achieve. Did have a 17-30 record in one-run games, so 13 below 500 there, which certainly did not help. But we were consistently bad to mediocre. We had a .625 winning percentage in April, and then we didn't have a winning month the rest of the season after that. We ended up very mediocre, middle of the pack, 11th in the AL in runs scored, and we were the definition of mediocre and average, finishing 8th in the AL in runs allowed. So much worse hitting and much worse pitching than a year ago. Even our defense wasn't as good as it's been the last few years. 4th in defensive efficiency, but 11th in zone rating this year. So everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong. Also had some pretty significant injury issues, but every team deals with those. That's not the reason we had such a rough year. One of those things, and hopefully we'll be around to make the decisions this offseason and try to get this Oakland franchise on a more consistently successful path in terms of our performance in Major League Baseball. And we'll start off taking a look at our pitching staff, which was sadly our strength this year. Jackson Ferris, who we picked up in a trade 2 off seasons ago at this point, had another nice year for us. 12-9 record, 3.47 ERA, over 200 strikeouts, 3 WAR. Fragile physically, and he's starting to make some significant money. Expected to make well over $6 million in arbitration next year, but probably will still look to bring him back for at least next season. Think that we can probably afford to pay around 10% of our payroll for our ace. Mason Miller, another pitcher who's fragile physically, and he had a rougher year after winning 14 games. He lost 14 games this year, a 5-14 record, 4.38 ERA. Still put up a 2.2 WAR, but definitely was one of the worst years of his major league career. He's set to make $7 million next year. Fortunately, that front-loaded contract that we signed him to is showing off the front-loaded tendencies by declining over the next few years. That said, might be a guy we need to move on from this coming off season for financial reasons. Jason DeCaro, who we picked up in the big trade with the Yankees a couple of months ago when we sent Bubba Chandler, the reigning AL Cy Young Award winner, as well as Willy Adames to the Yankees for DeCaro and an infielder, was not great for us. 2-6 record with a 4.35 ERA, was still a win above replacement. Think he can be an effective and cost-effective pitcher at the major league level for us for the next few years, but certainly more of a 3 or a 4 guy than an ace in the rotation. Hunter Brown had a pretty good year for us after we made him a minor league free agent signing. 7-2 record, 3.29 ERA, 32 years old now. It's just going to come down to finances with him, and he's looking for $17 million a year over 3 years, so he will be one and done in Oakland. And then Duncan Marston, who was our first round draft pick back in 2024, spent the whole year in the majors, 32 games out of the bullpen, 14 in the rotation. Was not particularly impressive. A 2-5 record with a 4.43 ERA. The issue in his development has always been his control and his inability to keep the ball in the park. And we saw both of those things this year with him allowing 24 homers and walking 58 batters. He was a replacement level player when all was said and done. We do still think he can get a little better, according to our scout. So the hope is that there might be a little more in terms of his potential to his ceiling that he can reach here. At 25 years old, probably will put him in the development lab this upcoming off season and hope we can extract some of those last few bits of his potential, but certainly looks like he's going to be more of a guy in the major leaguers, back end of the rotation, or a middle long reliever than someone who is truly an impact player, which is obviously disappointing for a guy that you picked fourth overall, but at least he's made the major leagues. Chase Lee, once again, had a solid year as our closer. Doesn't throw incredibly hard, but he was reasonably effective. 28 saves and a 2.91 ERA. Got an option for him at $2 million next year that I believe we will likely exercise. Joe Rock did a ton of different roles for us. You can see he ended the season as a stopper. He started 14 games for us, began the year as a setup man for us. When all was said and done, it was a pretty effective season. He was an all-star this year, 7-8 record, 3 saves, 3.66 ERA over 108 and a third innings with a 1.9 WAR. Admittedly, the beginning of his year was much better than the end of his year. Looking at the pitching splits, you can see that he had a brutal month of August in the rotation where he went 0-2 with an 11.91 ERA, and that was by far his worst month of the season. He's a guy, as a lefty, that we could look to bring back as a fourth or fifth starter, left-handed arm next year. Looking for $3.9 million. Not necessarily easy for the A's, given the financial situation that we're in, but it still may be a better option than some of the others that we'll have on the table. Keegan Aiken, we picked him up in a trade with Baltimore that I know some of you really dislike. He ended up pitching very well for us, 3-0 record with a 1.70 ERA over 42 and a third innings, but obviously we didn't end up making the playoffs. We weren't even close to having a winning record when all was said and done. So in retrospect, probably wish we hadn't brought him on board. You know, we'd be a 69 or a 70 win team most likely without Aiken, so not a big difference maker for us. Emmett Sheehan finally had the type of year out of our bullpen that we've always felt he could have. Won 8 games for us, had 8 holds, a 2.62 ERA over 75 and 2/3 innings. The issue is that he's starting to get expensive, probably going to be making about $4 million next year. You know, do we spend $4 million on a guy like Sheehan? Do we spend $4 million on a guy like Rock? Those are the kind of decisions we're going to have to be making this offseason. Sean Manaea ended up not doing all that great over the 15 games he pitched for us in the majors with a 5.18 ERA. Unlikely that he'll be back. I'm imagining he's going to be looking for some decent money as well. Actually, not crazy. $2 million-ish a year for 3 years, so maybe we think about bringing him back as a lefty, but I tend to think given his age and his fragility, even though the price is not bad, probably not the direction to go. Cody Funderburk, brutal first year with us, 6.70 ERA over 47 innings pitched, set to be making over $1.5 million in arbitration next year. He may be gone. Ben Leeper, 6.39 ERA over 49 and a third innings pitched for the former Rule 5 pick. By far the worst year he's had in Oakland. Another guy set to be making about $1.5 million next year. Going to be turning 34 next year. Probably someone we'd consider moving on from. Mitch Keller started the year in the rotation and did not do much there. Moved him to the bullpen, where he also wasn't excellent when all was said and done. 2-5 record, 6.86 ERA, and gave up a ridiculous 20 home runs in just 84 innings pitched, despite his ground ball tendencies. We've got team options on him for the next couple of seasons. After the performance he put up, it's going to be a tough decision for us to bring him back. And then Jose Hernandez, left-handed specialist for us this year, 4.79 ERA over 35 and two-thirds innings, was not particularly effective as a Rule 5 guy, given that we tried to just put him in the situations that we thought he'd be most effective at. Arbitration eligible, another guy making around $1.5 million next year. So we could be turning over a pretty significant amount of this pitching staff this upcoming off season. The only guys that I'm 100% sure right now that are going to be back with us next year are probably Jackson Ferris, Jason DeCaro, Duncan Marston, and Chase Lee. Certainly we'll have more than those four back when all is said and done, but I think everybody else, we at least need to think about the money they're looking for, think about their performance honestly and where they are in their careers, and probably going to have some real interesting decisions to make in the early days of this offseason. So before we take a look at our everyday players and start thinking about some decisions on that front, we'll find out who's going to be facing off in the World Series. That'll be either the Mariners or the Royals from the American League, facing off against the Rockies or the Cubs from the senior circuit. And it will be the Cubs against the Royals in the 2030 World Series. The Royals have had an impressive wild card run. Took out the two best teams in the American League, sweeping the Orioles 3-0 in the DS, and then taking out the Mariners in 6 games in the ALCS. The Cubs, after going to a 5th game against Milwaukee, swept the Rockies, who had the best record in all of the National League in the NLCS. So Cubs against the Royals here in the 2030 World Series. Before we find the results out there, let's take a look at our A's and start figuring out who might be back with us next year from this disappointing 2030 squad. And our catching situation was a challenge all year. Drake Baldwin missed the first 3 months of the season and then ended up banged up later in the year. Also was pretty productive when he was playing, hit 282 in 181 at-bats, 114 WRC plus, and a 1.6 WAR. The issue is that we would have been hoping he was in the lineup for another 60 or 70 games more than we actually got from him. His contract is reasonable for a pretty high-quality starting catcher. Going to be making $4.5 million next year, so he will almost certainly be back and hopefully will be healthier than he was this season. Agustin Ramirez, who had done a real nice job for us playing primarily against left-handed pitching a year ago, struggled when he was in the lineup more frequently against right-handed pitching, given the injury to Baldwin. Hit just a $1.99 this season in 367 at-bats, was slightly below replacement level. His glove is pretty much only average. We do like that he's reasonably effective against left-handed pitching, and certainly with the fact that he's only going to be making $2 million next year, should be in the mix to be our backup catcher, but can't say I guarantee that he's going to be back. I will, however, guarantee that Tyler Soderstrom will be back. He's been the best contract that we've had in this. Signed him to an 8-year deal, $15 million when he was unproven, and his ceiling wasn't as high as it's ended up being through some fortunate development. So he's going to be making $2 million next year, coming off of a career year in 2030 when he won the AL batting title, was an all-star, and also won a silver slugger. A bit of a regression this year, but he still hit 266 with 31 homers, 103 ribbies, 118 WRC plus. Solid year, but quite honestly, still a reduction of 3 plus in his WAR compared to a year ago when he had that career season for us, but still a very productive offensive player. Hideki Arakawa, not as effective in his second year as he was in his first. Struggled to keep the batting average over 200. Did have 11 homers and 57 ribbies in 366 at-bats. Only a 60 WRC plus, barely above replacement level. But given that he's set to make $1 million again next year, and he's solid defensively, he will certainly be in the mix for us as a middle infielder next year, because we're likely to be moving on from some of our more established players who are getting more expensive. Addison Barger came up in the month of September, hit a $196 and 51 at-bats. He's a guy we signed as a minor league free agent. Unlikely that he will be back. Colt Keith had a second straight really good year for us. When all was said and done, he hit 296 for the second consecutive year, 30 homers, 88 ribbies, and a 143 WRC plus. So similar to Soderstrom, didn't quite hit the heights that he hit in his career year in 2029, but still put up a 4.6 WAR. Interesting, when all was said and done, had exactly 504 hits, exactly 504 at-bats, and 149 hits in each of his 2 seasons in Oakland. Contract's starting to get a little more expensive, going to be at $13 million next year, and we're going to be responsible for 65% of that, so well over $9 million that we'll be on the hook for next year. But tend to think with our offense as bad as it is, we can't afford to get rid of our best offensive player, even if he's going to be expensive. Justin LeBron, the other guy that we picked up in the Bubba Chandler trade from the Yankees, and we picked him up in anticipation of losing some of our middle infielders. He was pretty productive for us, 262 average and 103 at-bats, 6 doubles, 5 homers, 111 WRC plus. A guy who's capable of playing just about any position in the infield. In a perfect world, he's more of a third baseman than anything else, but can play second or short in a pinch, has a good personality, and importantly, he'll still be making the major league minimum next year. One of the guys that I've been talking about and alluding to that we might need to move on from is Brian Rincon. Ended up having a reasonably productive offensive year, was basically a league average offensive player, which when you combine that with his outstanding defense, helped him still put up a 3.9 WAR. But certainly regressed from a year ago, hitting just 225 with 10 homers and 20 doubles. All of those numbers significantly lower than they were in 2029. He's fragile physically, and he's set to be making around $8 million next year. I think that may be difficult for us to fit in given our financial constraints, which again could mean that Arakawa and or LeBron have a more significant role for us next year. We'll talk about a couple other infielders who have been playing outfield more recently, since we're talking about the infield right now. Diane Jorge, an infielder who we've also trained to be an outfielder, was actually pretty productive for us offensively when we brought him up. Like the contact in the eye, decent speed, not a lot of power, but he did hit 285, and he drew 44 walks with 344 at-bats. So a 113 WRC plus, a guy who's a competent defensive outfielder, a guy who's basically a competent defensive infielder as well, can play a number of positions, and probably will have a more prominent position next year if we need to move on from Rincon. or if we need to move on from Cameron Cawley, who most recently has been playing center field for us with some injuries to Luis Lara. Love his glove in the outfield, love his glove in the infield, but he's 27, soon to be 28 years old, fragile physically, set to make well over $4.5 million next year. This was by far the healthiest season of his career, and he actually led the league with 8 triples, but when all was said and done, he still hit .228 with a 79 WRC plus. You look at his 5 years in the majors, and he's only had over 256 at-bats once because of some significant injuries. Coming off of, I guess, what for him would be a career year, having actually, been at the plate 460 times, and as we talked about, led the league in triples, established career highs in doubles, triples, homers, ribbies, stolen bases, hits, just about everything. But I think it's unlikely we're going to have Cawley and Rincon back next year. I think the question is whether we can afford to have Rincon or Cawley back next year, which, as I talked about, could mean more prominent roles for the likes of Jorge, LeBron, and Arakawa. We know that Soderstrom should be at first, and Colt Keith will be at third. So those guys that we've just talked about likely competing for second base and shortstop. And it's possible that Rincon or Cawley does end up back with us, but financially, I just don't think there's any way we can afford both of them. Moving on to our outfielders, we kind of could have used the fact that we lost last year's ALCS and World Series MVP for most of the year, 5 games into the season, as foreshadowing for what this team was going to end up looking like. DeLauder did come back in mid-September, but it was a completely lost year for him. Hit a .198 and 81 at-bats. He's honestly going to be another interesting decision for us. Despite the postseason heroics last year, he was a 118 WRC plus guy over the course of his full season with us, which is solid and something that we need. But he's also set to get a raise to about $6 million next year. We should be able to sign him for around 5.7 if we're proactive in the negotiations. If we could guarantee that he put up an offensive year similar to what he did in 2029, I think we probably bring him back. But with the money he's looking for, it's at least a decision that we have to think about coming off of this brutal year that he just had with us. Tyler Stevenson, signed him as a minor league free agent, spent most of the year in AAA. He was actually pretty productive as a September call-up, a .304 average and 46 at-bats, 117 WRC plus. Luis Lara, center fielder, fragile physically, signed to a pretty reasonable contract, so he'll probably be back next year. Pretty much a league average offensive player, 2.2 WAR, competent defensively. Not the most exciting guy in the world, but if he can be a competent offensive and competent defensive player for us at a decent price point, probably someone who will still be around next year. The hope is that as Jake Ortega gets closer to coming to the majors, he may eventually take over as our full-time center fielder, and Lara may end up being a guy who plays in a platoon situation or more as a fourth outfielder going forward. Lawrence Butler, set to make $5 million next year, and might be a guy that it's time to move on from. On paper, looking at his ratings against right-handed pitching, have felt that he could be a competent offensive player for us, but when all is said and done, more often than not, he really hasn't been. Put up an 81 WRC plus for a second consecutive season, WAR of around a half for a second consecutive season. For $5 million next year, I don't think we can afford to bring him back at that price. The question is just what type of trade market there might be available for him as we try to get him off the books in this coming off season. Gabriel Gonzalez traded for the Giants, or traded for him from the Giants just about a year ago. 268 average, 17 doubles, 7 homers, and 336 at-bats. Basically a league average offensive player, competent defensively, put up a 0.8 WAR. Certainly a guy who could be seeing more action if we move on from Butler. Although, to be honest, Gonzalez's number is going to be in the $4.5 million range. So his spot on the roster also potentially in some jeopardy. And then Jared Kelnick, minor league free agent that we brought up in September, hit 256 with an 86 WRC plus over 82 at-bats. He will likely not be back next year. So as we think about this team, we're definitely going to need to cut some salary. You can see we're right now projected to be about $20 million more next year than we are right now. And that's why guys like Mason Miller, Chase DeLauder, Brian Rincon, the injured Mason Black, we didn't talk about him. He ended up out with a torn UCL after an outstanding year as our stopper in 2029. Filled a number of different roles for us this year, including the rotation, but was 6-10 with a 5.90 ERA. He's out for all of next year, or most of next year, with a torn UCL, set to make about $6.5 million. So we'll look to trade him if anyone wants to take a flyer on him. We certainly can't afford to be spending $6.5 million, which will be roughly 10% of our overall payroll on a guy who's likely to miss everything except maybe a few starts or a few weeks of September. So Mason Black will move on from. We talked about Gonzalez, Cauley, Sheehan, guys that we've got some tough decisions to make on. Joe Rock, even a decision. I think Diane Jorge will be back. Chase Lee will be back. I think Jackson Ferris will be back. Colt Keith will be back. Drake Baldwin will be back. Lawrence Butler, another guy that we need to make a decision on. So there's several paths for us to remove 15 to 20 million out of this payroll pretty easily. But keep in mind, if we only remove 15 to 20 million out of the payroll, that's not giving us much to improve this team this offseason, which is going to be important coming off of a 71-win season. Thinking about financials, with the third best farm system in baseball, we want to continue investing pretty heavily in player development. Coming off of this brutal year, we're going to be picking much earlier in the draft, so we're going to need more money in the draft budget. So I don't know why we would get an increase in payroll after it was just cut by $2 million after winning a World Series and delivering $27 million in earnings compared to the $2 million in earnings we're going to have delivered this season. So I'd love it if the payroll got bumped, but it would be quite illogical for that to happen after the disappointing season we've had. So we're going to have to cut a fair amount of payroll to. So we're going to need to cut a lot out of payroll to ensure that we can do something in the off season, and that we're going to have enough money for the draft, hopefully with a top 5 pick after we get through the lottery. And we don't want to cut the budget back. So as I said, there's no rational reason that I'd expect our budget to be better. If anything, it could be worse. So we're going to be needing to move on from probably at least 3, if not 4 or 5 guys who were major league contributors this year, just to get the finances in a better spot than they are right now. And it looks like it's probably actually a pretty evenly matched World Series with the 2 Central Division champions, the 91-win Cubs, facing off against the Royals, who were in that wacky 3-way tie for the AL Central this year. And we'll find out whether Missouri or Illinois has bragging rights as the 2030 World Series champions. And the Chicago Cubs have completed a dominant playoff run after having to go to a Game 5 in that NLDS against their division rival Brewers. They swept the Rockies out of the playoffs in the NLCS, and they just swept the Royals out of the playoffs here in the 2030 World Series. I believe that's the second World Championship for the Cubbies in this mythical universe that we've created here in OOTP 25. And that was, as I noted, the second championship for the Cubs since we've started this playthrough. The Guardians won in 24 and 25, the Cubs in 26, the Cardinals in 27. Diamondbacks finally broke the stranglehold of the Central Division teams in 28. We continued that last year, and the Cubs have it back to the Central Division teams here in 2030. So 7 years into this playthrough, and none of those big market teams from the Eastern Division have ever won the World Series, although the Braves were in 2 in a row where they lost to the Guardians, and then the Orioles, the Red Sox, and the Rays all made it from the AL East in 2026 through 2028, but all came up short against their National League rivals. And it's going to be a busy offseason for us. We've got those option year decisions that I mentioned on Chase Lee and Mitch Keller, but I can see up here that my contract's been extended. We'll find out shortly whether it's a long-term extension or whether we're heading into a lame duck season with Mr. Fisher. Have some personnel leaving, scouting director Tim Bishop. We've also got some minor league coaches that we're looking for, some retirements in the minor leagues, and our team trainer left as well. So have some definite decisions to make, and not great when we're going to be moving on from a potentially really good scout in Tim Bishop, but we're willing to explore different alternatives, but obviously not optimal for that to happen right at the start of the off season. Contract extended for just 1 year, so that's definitely a sign that he's expecting better things next season than this season. Development facilities open, arbitration period open. Another player from Las Vegas retired. Review of season goals, not expecting it to be happened. Goal was to make the playoffs, and we failed. Still work to do on attendance. Not a lot of homegrown talent. Not good fan engagement. Year was certainly a setback. Do hope we can at least get back to the playoffs next year. So I thought sometimes when you have just a brutally horrible year like this, some of those goals get re-racked. Doesn't look like it will be the case. Says he's satisfied with our performance in accomplishing goals, and his overall mood with us is happy. So from that perspective, a little surprised we only got 1 year. Wants us to achieve a winning record. Upgrade at center field. Well, fortunately, we've got Ortega. That may help us do that. More drafted players to the team. Ortega should help with that as well. Still wants us to build a championship team in the next 2 seasons. So ambitious goals from Mr. Fisher. And he's given us an ambitious budget to achieve it. That's illogical to me. I'm still thrilled that it happened. I don't understand why the budget now is up to $144 million next year, coming off of the worst season that we've had. I guess maybe since he's got me in a prove it season, he's going to give me an opportunity to prove it or not before he decides whether to give us an extension. But again, as we talked about earlier, last year we made $27 million and unexpectedly won the World Series with the lowest budget in baseball, and he cut us back by $2 million. This year we had the worst season we've had in our 7 years in charge with a .438 winning percentage, and we only made $2 million, and he just gave us a $20 million bump in the budget. Again, I'm not going to complain about it. Maybe the fact that we have strung a few years together where we've made money, we've made money every year since 2027 at this point, makes him a little more confident that I can manage a budget responsibly and still deliver him a profit. But it's definitely a put up or shut up type year for us, with the fact that we're only on a 1 year deal and we've got as much money to spend as we've ever had in this playthrough. Now, admittedly, even with that 144 million, it's going to be the lowest budget in all of baseball. And even if we brought everybody back that we could, which we're not going to, we'd still have the lowest payroll in baseball. But at least we've got a little bit more financial flexibility as we prepare for this offseason to begin. And although we're at this point with no scout on board, stuck with some pretty mediocre OSA ratings on people, does look like there's certainly going to be some interesting talent at the top end of the market as far as position players. Unlikely that we're going to be able to afford any of them unless we make significant cuts to this team. Pitching-wise, definitely some high-end talent, particularly among the relievers, but for the most part, not guys that we are going to be able to afford. So I did take a look, and there are some interesting scouts available that should allow us to get younger in our scouting department, and hopefully when all is said and done, maybe even upgrade our scouting department a bit. So I think it was probably the right decision to move on from Mr. Bishop, but it will make the next few months a little more frustrating as we try to rescout the world. And it's going to be a very busy start to the off season. You can see we've got about a dozen guys who are arbitration eligible, including some we would definitely prefer to move on from, like Mason Black, perhaps Cody Funderburk. We've talked about Rincon. We've talked about Cawley, Gonzalez maybe even DeLauder, Sheehan, Hernandez, Joe Rock, possible. I'd say the only arbitration eligible players who I know we're going to try to bring back are Jackson Ferris and Diane Jorge. Probably will ultimately bring back more than just those two, but I'd say those are the only two that are definitely going to be back. So an opportunity for us to clear some money off the books by moving on from some of these guys, and hopefully in some cases get some interesting players back in trade as well. So probably we'll sim ahead several days between now and the next episode, because I'm just going to be constantly shopping guys, trying to figure out if there's some trade targets that the more valuable players that we might be moving on from, the Sheehans, the Rincons, the DeLauders, the Cawleys of the world. I don't think we'll move on from all of those guys, but if one or two of them have a lot more trade value, that may also help influence who we ultimately move on from. So hopefully over the next day or two in real life and the next several days in game time, we'll be able to clear up some of the contractual issues with this team, and hopefully maybe even pull off a trade or two of younger talent that's more economical that we can use to supplement this team. Because even with the increase in the budget, given that we are going to need a lot more money in our draft budget next year, and we're going to want to keep player development high given our strong farm system, although it looks like we've slipped to 6th, and Ortega has slipped all the way back to 4th in the post season system rankings, but we do have more top 100 players now with Landine moving into the top 100 also. But we're going to need more money for the draft. We're going to want to put more money in player development. So we're going to need to make a lot of moves. So it's going to be a pivotal offseason, as they often are, for these Oakland A's here in 2030 to 2031. And we'll find out what type of progress we're able to make in the early stages of this offseason in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.